Hey everybody, I've got chapter 27, book 2 of the Royal Rangers series, the Red Fox Clan, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. The hunting party assembled in the Castle Heirloom courtyard the following morning, just as the sun was rising over the tops of the trees at the base of the hill. The three Scandians were already waiting when Maddie and Cassandra emerged from the keep tower. Maddie and Cassandra were accompanied by Damone. He was armed with a long hunting bow, a solid weapon, but not as long or as powerful as the war bows carried by the castle's archers or the ranger corps. The two princesses were armed with their slings, and each had a bulging pouch of lead shot at her belt. In case of emergencies, Maddie was also carrying a bow slung over her shoulder. With a draw weight of only 40 pounds, it was not as powerful as the recurve bow she used as a ranger, so it didn't have the range and hitting power. But it would be useful enough for hunting. The sling wasn't suitable for all forms of game, she knew. Damone smiled when he saw the bow. "What do you expect to hit with that?" he asked. He had seen the standard of Maddie's archery, or at least he thought he had. She shrugged. "You never know. I might get lucky." He shook his head. "Not sure there's that much luck in the world." Stig and Thorn were both armed with heavy spears. Hal had a crossbow slung over his back. Cassandra had arranged for it to be fetched from the ship by the servants who took food to the rest of the Heron's crew. "Good morning, gentlemen," Cassandra said cheerfully, and they replied with a chorus of greetings. "I trust you slept well?" Stig grimaced cheerfully. "I find it hard to get used to the fact that my bed isn't moving when I come ashore after a long voyage," he said, "although it feels as if it is." Hal agreed with Stig. "It takes a while to get your land legs back. By contrast, when we're on board the ship, it feels as if it's not moving at all," he said. "We'll be rolling around as if we're drunk for a day or so." "Why is that?" Maddie asked. She had no experience of sailing or ships, and was finding their observations interesting. The two Scandians shrugged. "Nobody knows," Stig said. "It just happens that way. I guess we get used to the ship rolling, and when that's not happening anymore, we somehow think it is." The seventh member of the party was Olwen, a grizzled old forester who had hunted the woods around Castle Heirloom for the past 30 years. He would act as their guide on the hunt, seeking out and following the tracks left by game, deer, rabbits and hares, and wildfowl. He carried a bow and had a long-bladed hunting knife in a scabbard on his belt. He was accompanied by his hunting dog, Dougal, a rather scruffy beast of indeterminate lineage, who lolled his tongue out at them. Dougal was getting on in years, and he had a stiff rear leg, but that didn't dampen his enthusiasm for hunting, fetching game, and tracking. Olwen had known Cassandra since she was a girl, and was totally devoted to her. He nodded a greeting as he joined them. "Morning, Your Highness," he said. Cassandra smiled at him as she leaned down to scratch Dougal's floppy ears. "Good morning, Olwen. I trust you'll be able to find us some game today." He nodded several more times. "That'll be so, my lady. We'll strike out down to the lake, where we should find geese and ducks." He nodded at the sling coiled under her belt. "You should be able to bring down a few with that sling of yours. Then we'll angle over towards Sentinel Hill. There's been deer sighted there in the last few days." "Sighted by whom?" Maddie asked. He grinned knowingly at her. "Why, by me, my young lady," he said. She nodded to herself. She would have expected him to go out the previous day and search for the best hunting spots for them. Olwen looked around, making sure everyone was ready. "Shall we go?" Out of deference to the Scandians, they had elected not to ride. They walked down across the drawbridge and headed downhill toward the forest, Olwen leading the way. The grass was still wet with dew, and looking behind them, Maddie could see the dark tracks they were leaving as they displaced the moisture from the grass. They passed the small grove that masked the entrance to the tunnel under the moat, and she surreptitiously studied her companions to see if anyone noticed anything unusual about the spot. Nobody did, of course. People had been walking past that hidden tunnel for years, without seeing anything out of the ordinary. Olwen led them slightly to the right, and she was relieved to see they would pass well clear of the glade where Bumper was tethered. She doubted that anyone else would sense his presence, but she couldn't be sure of Olwen or Dougal. She started suddenly as she heard the whir of Cassandra's sling beside her and the hiss of her shot as she let fly. A hare had broken cover in the grass 10 meters ahead of them. It had barely reached half speed when the lead shot smacked into it and bowled it over. "Stay awake," her mother told her. Maddie made an appreciative gesture with her hands. "Good shot," she said, and the Scandians chorused their agreement. Cassandra smiled a little smugly. "It has to be admitted. Even with my faulty technique?" Maddie shook her head with a tired grin. She and her mother used totally different techniques with their slings, and Maddie had always held that Cassandra's was less efficient and slower than her own. Her mother was obviously delighted that she had scored before her daughter, beating her to the shot. Olwen gathered the hare into his game bag, and they moved on into the trees. "What's wrong with Cassandra's technique?" Hal asked. Maddie sniffed. "Just about everything. She makes up for bad technique with extraordinary good luck." "Ha!" her mother snorted, and gave her a superior smile. Maddie held her tongue. "We'll see what's what when we reach the lake," she thought to herself. But, to her chagrin, when she and Cassandra let fly at 2 rising ducks, her shot grazed the tail of the one she aimed at, doing no more than knocking a feather loose, whereas her mother's target dropped like a stone into the lake as her shot hit dead center. In spite of his stiff rear leg, Dougal bounded away, hurling himself into the lake and churning the water to retrieve the fallen bird. "Ha!" said Cassandra again, as Dougal dropped the duck at her feet. Maddie reddened, but said nothing. Again, Olwen gathered the prize into his game bag. Thorn watched the byplay between the two women with amusement. "So," he said to Maddie, "your mother whirls her sling around her head horizontally 2 or 3 times and then releases. You don't do that. You let it fall back behind your shoulder, then you step forward and whip the sling overhead to release it." He looked at Hal, who was always interested in the mechanics of weaponry. "Sort of like the way Lydia uses her atlatl, isn't it?" Hal agreed. "No whirling," he said. Maddie regarded them both, not sure if they were teasing her, and felt the heat rising in her cheeks. "It's more efficient my way," she said, trying to sound objective. "All that whirling and whirring wastes time and gives game a chance to escape, or an enemy to shoot first." "I can see that," Hal replied solemnly. "Yet," said Cassandra, "here am I with a duck and a hare in the bag, and you, with your superior method, have downed— how many?" "Oh, that's right," she said. "Precisely none." "The day isn't over yet, Mother," Maddie told her, speaking very precisely. They moved on from the lake. The other ducks and geese there had all taken flight, and it would be some time before they settled to the water again. The hunting party headed towards Sentinel Hill, and Maddie began to see signs that deer had passed this way recently. She didn't let on that she'd seen the tracks. That would be a little out of character for a princess. But it was evident that Olwen had noticed them, and she saw him nodding contentedly to himself. He appeared to have missed something else, though, and she thought it might be important that he knew about it. She pointed to several long gashes in the bark of a tree, low down and close to the ground. "What caused this, Olwen?" she asked, ingenuously. "Why, that was well spotted, my lady," Olwen said. He went down on one knee and touched the slashes. Maddie could see from where she stood that the sap on the disturbed bark was dry. The marks were many hours old. Olwen looked up at her. "I saw these yesterday when I was scouting," he said. "A boar did this, my lady." She made her eyes widen. "A wild boar?" she asked breathlessly. The old hunter smiled grimly. "Well, we don't have any tame ones around here, Lady Madeline, but he'll be long gone by now," he said reassuringly. But Maddie had noticed something that the old hunter seemed to have missed. There were several more slashes on an adjacent tree, and the sap was still oozing wetly in them. "What about those?" she asked. Olwen looked, then frowned. He said thoughtfully. Those were made today, and not so long ago. Then he raised his voice to speak to the rest of the group. Eyes open, everyone. We don't want to come upon this one without seeing him first. Thorn had watched the interplay between the young princess and Olwen. He wasn't taken in by her pretended ignorance. You knew perfectly well what those marks were, he thought, and you wanted the rest of us to be on the alert for the boar. Maddie turned suddenly and caught him looking at her. He grinned and tapped one finger along the side of his nose. She frowned at him, suspecting that he'd seen through her play-acting, then shook her head and turned away. They moved on through the trees, conscious that the boar might be close to them, and knowing that the sling would be virtually useless against it. She had coiled up the weapon and tucked it into her belt. Instead, she knocked an arrow to the bowstring and held the bow loosely, ready to shoot if necessary. Damon saw the movement and smiled to himself once more, shaking his head. They were working in a large half-circle, planning to return to the lake, where the ducks might have resettled. Hal sighted a small deer and shot it with his crossbow. It was a good shot. The little animal leapt into the air, ran half a dozen paces, then fell dead. Olwen quickly field-dressed it, and Thorn and Stig tied its 4 legs over a stout sapling, carrying it between them. Maddie estimated they were halfway back to the lake, when Dougal began barking frantically and darted forward toward a dense thicket of bushes at the far side of the clearing they were crossing. The hunters stopped, startled by his sudden outburst. From the thicket, they could hear the movement of a large, heavy body, crashing into the bushes and branches, and hear an enraged, threatening squeal. "It's the boar!" Olwen yelled, then called to his frantic, near-hysterical dog. "Dougal, back away now! Back away!" But Dougal paid him no heed. The old dog darted forward toward the thicket, shoving his head between the dense-growing bushes and barking non-stop. The noises from within the thicket increased, and then, suddenly, Dougal turned tail and retreated as a shaggy, dark figure erupted from the bushes and charged after him. The little dog tried to dodge, but his stiff back leg betrayed him, and he stumbled so that the boar was upon him. It butted its head into his ribs, and he squealed in fright and pain as the impact threw him several meters. The hunters began to move in. Stig and Thorn dropped the carcass of the deer and moved forward, spears raised. Hal brought up his crossbow, and Damon knocked an arrow to his bow. Olwen was panicking, terrified that his dog would be injured. Luckily, the boar had not used its tusks so far. The boar dashed forward, and Dougal managed to leap awkwardly to one side, evading the slashing tusks. As the 2 animals moved round each other, one slashing and squealing, the other dodging awkwardly, none of the hunters had a clear shot or cast at the boar, except Maddie. For 3 years, she had been trained to recognize and take advantage of a split-second opportunity. Now, she had one, as Dougal backed away, and the boar hesitated, drawing back on its haunches and preparing for a final charge. She drew, sighted, and released in one fluid movement. The arrow flashed across the clearing and thudded home, penetrating deep behind the boar's left shoulder and tearing into its heart. The savage beast squealed once, reared onto its hind legs, and then fell dead on the grass, its legs sticking out stiffly. Instantly, Maddie let out a panicked squeal of her own and let the bow drop to the ground in front of her. When the others realized where the arrow had come from, they turned to face her, but she was standing, shaking, her hands covering her eyes, and calling frantically. "What happened? What happened? Did I hit it?" Her companions heaved a collective sigh of relief. The tension went out of the clearing as they looked again at the dead boar. "You hit it all right, my lady," said Olwen. "Killed it, stone dead." Stig and Hal echoed his words of praise. Damon looked on in utter disbelief. Maddie took her hands from her eyes and looked at Olwen wide-eyed. "I did," she said in tones of total surprise. "But I had my eyes shut." She did it that, said a voice behind her. Had them shut tight the whole time. It was Thorn. She realized that the old Scandian had been standing behind her and had likely witnessed the entire event, had seen her cool, disciplined handling of the bow, then her pretense at panic as she hurled it to the ground. She met his gaze now as Damone knelt beside the boar and shook his head. If that's the case, that was the luckiest shot I've ever seen, Damone said slowly. As Matty studied the old sea-wolf, he let one eye slide shut in a surreptitious wink. If you don't want him to know, I'm not saying anything, the movement said. They circled back to the lake, with Damone and Hal carrying the boar, and Stig and Thorn with the deer between them. They'd be hard put to carry any more large animals, and Hal looked appreciatively at the two carcasses. Edvin will be pleased, he said. That's plenty of fresh meat for the trip home. They added to their bag at the lake, with Cassandra bringing down 3 more ducks, and Matty accounting for a goose and a mallard. Dougal, thoroughly chastened now, brought the birds ashore for them. And there's tonight's dinner taken care of, Cassandra said, with a satisfied smile. They dined on roast goose that night in the refectory adjoining the kitchens. The rest of the Heron's crew were summoned to join them, and it was a festive and cheerful occasion, marred only slightly by the fact that Damone hurriedly excused himself on the pretext of duty. Matty noted again that he seemed somewhat uncomfortable around the Scandians. She puzzled over it for a few minutes, then dismissed it. Hal and his crew were excellent company, boisterous and cheerful, with a fund of exciting stories to tell. If Damone chose to be prickly around them, that was his problem. They were demolishing a fig pudding after the main meal, when a servant entered and spoke quietly to Cassandra. She listened, then pointed out Hal. The servant moved down the table to where the skirl was waiting expectantly. "Captain Hal, there's a messenger here for you. He's a Scandian, and he says it's urgent." She nodded toward the door, leading to the stairway where a figure could be seen waiting just outside. Hal glanced interrogatively at Cassandra, who nodded. Then he beckoned to the waiting man. "Come in," he said, and as the newcomer moved out of the shadows into the light, he recognized him. "Is that you, Sten Ingolson?" "Yes, Hal, it's me all right." Hal turned to Cassandra and explained. "Sten is the first mate on a Wolfbiter." "Wolfbiter?" Cassandra said. "Isn't she the current duty ship?" "Yes," Hal told her. "Jern Ice Runner is her skirl. We spoke with Jern 2 days ago when he reached the mouth of the Seamath where she was patrolling." He turned his attention back to Sten. "Is there a problem?" he asked, although as he said it, he realized that Sten would hardly be here if there wasn't. "Wolfbiter is damaged, Hal," Sten said. "She went on to Barrier Rocks, south of the Seamath. A rogue wave picked her up and dumped her heavily. Jern managed to get her to the beach, but he thinks her back might be broken. He wants you to take a look before he decides to abandon her." Stig leaned toward Matty and said in a low whisper, "Hal is an expert shipbuilder as well as a skirl. If Wolfbiter can be repaired, he'll be able to tell them." Hal was rubbing his chin. "I'd best go and take a look," he said. Then he turned to Cassandra. "We'll leave straight away, my lady," he said. "That way, we'll just catch the outgoing tide. I don't like the idea of the duty ship being out of action any longer than it has to be." Cassandra nodded. "Neither do I, with this Red Fox clan disrupting things," she said. "How long do you think you'll be?" Hal paused, screwing up his eyes, while he considered the problem. "A week, maybe 10 days at the most. If we have to abandon her, I'll need to bring her crew back with us, and we'll need to provision the ship for the trip home. We can finalize the details for the Archers then, too," he nodded, as an afterthought. "I'll have the papers ready to sign, Hal, and I'll have the boar and your deer salted and ready to go as well," Cassandra said. Hal nodded his thanks, then turned to his crew. "Right, lads, we'd better be moving. The tide won't wait for us, and it'll be hard rowing if it turns." There was a clatter as benches were pushed back from the table, and the Heron's crew rose to their feet and began making their way toward the door. Stig paused halfway and turned back, reaching across the table to tear a leg from the carcass of the goose. He ripped a large chunk off with his teeth and grinned at Matty. "I never waste good food," he said. Hal snorted derisively. "You never waste any food," he said. "Now let's get moving." And that's going to be the end of Chapter 27. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 28. God bless, and have a good one.